کنفرانس مطبوعاتی در مقابل مقر سازمان ملل در نیویورک 11 ژوئیه 2013 20 تیر 92.
Three different speakers, and we'll be talking about the range of issues that are implicated by this situation and the urgency for the UN Security Council to act in its forthcoming renewal of the UNAMI mandate on the 24th of July. But what we have today, both Tahar Boumedra, who spent 3 years working for Ambassador Kobler with UNAMI in Iraq, who will be able to shed some light on what has actually taken place over the last several years and the role of the United Nations and its complicity and direct involvement in the human rights abuses that have taken place against the residents of Camp Ashraf and Liberty. We also have family members of some of the residents themselves to speak in personal terms about what their loved ones have gone through and about their own experiences in that regard. That it was clear from the outset that Camp Liberty was, an exceptionally small space, about a half a square mile, a little bit larger in square kilometers. No protection inside the camp from rocket attacks or other potential violence that could be brought upon the residents. All of the security that had been in Camp Liberty when the Americans were there had been all removed from the camp. All of the 4-meter tall T-walls had been taken outside of the camp and were literally just at the camp perimeter. And the conditions were terrible. Initially, the Iraqis prevented hundreds of air conditioners from being delivered. The generators were operating at 20 or 30% capacity, and it was 110 degrees outside on a typical day. And the promises that had been made on the face of it clearly were being flagrantly violated by the UN. So let's talk about where we are today. In the last year, there have been 3 attacks on Camp Liberty. Today, 3,100 residents from Camp Ashraf originally who are now at Camp Liberty. And about 2,000 of them have been interviewed by UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees. Approximately 1,500 have been told that they will have refugee status, but none have been given their papers demonstrating that they are in fact refugees. The UN Security Council resolution that established UNAMI talked about the mission of UNAMI being to promote and protect human rights. And it also talks about the need for the safe and orderly return of refugees and for their safety and security. Of course, this is not what has been going on with the residents of Camp Liberty. The UNHCR guidelines on the protection of asylum seekers articulates that there are 10 guidelines as to how asylum seekers should be treated in a situation anywhere in the world. When you look at the full list of 10 guidelines, and UNHCR literally in the last year just promulgated these guidelines again, 8 of the 10 guidelines are being violated as we speak. And UNHCR has in essence put on blinders and is operating in the camp pretending as if the rights of these residents are not being violated. And they're looking at the situation and they are basically saying, we are going to come in, we're going to do our narrow task, which is going to be focusing on interviewing these individual people and determining whether or not they should be considered refugees. And we're going to ignore the rest of what's going on around us. Now that's problematic for 2 reasons. They're not even really doing their job in the way that they should. And by that, what I mean is that they could have long ago made a group determination, and because they're all members of the same organization, which is a death penalty offense in Iran, they have all been cleared by 7 U.S. intelligence agencies as not committing violence and terrorism, and they're all collected in a common spot and face serious danger. These are all the general criteria that the UNHCR manual puts forward for doing a group determination. So they should have done a group determination long ago. They still haven't. The other way that they are acting contrary to their own stated purpose and mission relates to the fact that their own manual on the security of persons of concern makes very clear that people who are refugees or asylum seekers or persons of concern more broadly, if there's an attack on their camp, should be immediately relocated to a safe third location. And this is something, again, that UNHCR has ignored in terms of its own guidelines. And again, UNHCR does nothing to address this. So what are we asking for? In the first instance, because of the security threat, of course, the people should be returned to Camp Ashraf. This is logical from a number of perspectives. It's logical because they've been attacked 3 times, killing 10 and wounding 100. It's logical because the camp is very small. At a bare minimum, the international community should be calling for the immediate fortification of the camp. The tens of thousands of T-walls that are outside the camp should be allowed to immediately be brought into the camp to fortify the camp. UNHCR should, of course, also immediately grant group determination for all of the residents, give them all their refugee papers, which I believe is also critical, that the UN ultimately conduct an investigation into what has taken place in this overall situation and the UN's involvement and its complicity and its direct actions to further the goals of the government of Iran and the government of Iraq with respect to the outcome of the situation on the ground and the ongoing mistreatment of the residents and their ongoing security threats that they face. So let me stop there, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Boumedra, who will speak for a few minutes about his own experience working with UNAMI, and he'll also, I think, illuminate a fair amount of what has happened in the last several years based on his own personal experience in Iraq, working with Mr. Kobler from 2009 to 2012.
Ladies and gentlemen, I went to Iraq in 2009 to promote and protect human rights. That was my mission, and I was appointed as Chief of the Human Rights Office of UNAMI. In 2011, I found myself, instead of promoting and protecting human rights, I found myself doing exactly the opposite, and I found myself covering up for otherwise illegal action by the United Nations, presenting it to the international community as the realities that are prevailing in Camp Liberty and Camp Ashraf. So we really worked very hard to doctor reports, including pictures, to convince not only the Ashrafis but also the international community that their move to liberty is a necessary step, first step for their departure from Iraq. And that Camp Liberty, as a temporary location, will guarantee the safety and security of these people. And we knew very well it does not. We conducted in December 2011 2 assessments. One assessment on the humanitarian situation in Camp Liberty. Second assessment on the security issues in Camp Liberty. And both reports were negative. But UNAMI insisted on presenting to the international community the opposite. We said that Camp Liberty meets the international standards for accommodating refugees and refugee camps. How did we do that? We falsified documents, and I say falsified documents. The United Nations appointed an expert called shelter expert. He was brought from Ethiopia. He is of a Swiss nationality, Martin Zeren. He was brought to assess the situation, the humanitarian situation in Camp Liberty. And he worked on this for 2 weeks and came to the conclusion that Camp Liberty does not meet those requirements. Kobler, the SRG, the representative of special representative of Secretary General, told him, "You've been brought here to certify. So we want you to certify." The man is a professional. Martin Zeren is a professional. He refused to certify. And Kobler went on and certified himself by issuing a statement on 31st of January 2012, saying that now UNHCR and Human Rights Office of UNAMI agree that the Camp Liberty meets the standards required. As to the security situation, that report had never been brought to the attention of everyone, even though we briefed the diplomatic community in Baghdad on a weekly basis. But we never told them that the assessment is that the camp is vulnerable to aerial attacks, because it's always rockets that are used in the situation in Baghdad particularly. So we knew very well that the camp could be reached from any corner. Plus, given the density of the population in this half kilometer square, 600 meters square, such a density make it, you throw a stone from outside the Camp Liberty into the camp, you are bound to hit somebody. So this is exactly what happened. And the report, the assessment report, came out to say that we need to reinforce the security, the protection measures. How did we do that? The UNAMI asked the United Nations to authorize the recruitment of more soldiers to protect. But to protect who? Not to protect the Ashrafis, to protect the UN personnel. So 62 Fijian soldiers were recruited to do this job, but with what kind of budget, what kind of money? Where does it come from, this money? Because this happened at the time where there was no budget and the United Nations was not prepared to spend a penny on this project. So this remains a question to be elucidated, to be clarified. Then again, this is the kind of job that I find myself doing, sort of hiding and protecting, covering up all this. I came to the conclusion that that is not really dignifying to a human rights officer, and I had to resign. But resigning is not the sort of objective of my action. The objective of the action is to bring to the attention of the international community what's really happening on the ground. And I witnessed a lot of things. I was advising the government of Iraq. I was advising the people in Ashraf. I was advising the diplomatic community in Baghdad on how the situation should be handled. And obviously, the United Nations, UNAMI, was literally under the instructions and the command of the Iraqi government under the leadership of Nouri Maliki. And we misled everybody, including the organization of the United Nations itself. We misled everybody, and we closed Camp Ashraf. We qualified it as a relocation, while it is a forcible transfer, yes. But if you close Camp Ashraf and open a place where, without any exaggeration, I would say, is a prison, then the working group against arbitrary arrest has exactly said that Camp Liberty is a prison. And if that is the case, why is the United Nations involving itself in evicting people from their homes and sending them to prisons without any due process of law, without any court proceedings? The United Nations should not and must not act against its own guidelines, against its own values. And unfortunately, somebody in the United Nations took the lead on this with the SRG Martin Kobler. He violated every single value that the United Nations stands for. But for the Middle Eastern people, dignity, it means a lot. And the next SRG should keep this in mind. Safety, security, and dignity are very important. So he should start from the day he arrives on achieving this. If we do not put pressure on the United Nations to put together its act and do its mandate as it should be done and protect rather than persecute. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jared, for actually organizing this important panel, and I want to thank Mr. Boumediero for your insightful remarks regarding the inner workings of UNAMI and, quite frankly, the abuses that are taking place in that process. I really want to do kind of build upon what Jared shared with his kind of a insight and analysis of what's really taking place behind the scenes, and take it one level deeper and say there is a triangle effect that's going on in terms of Camp Liberty and the situation of the residents there. With the Iranian regime at the helm of this triangle, and Martin Kobler on one side of it and the Iraqi government on the other side of it. It is the Iranian regime that is manipulating the situation with its political agenda, and unfortunately leveraging the biases that Mr. Kobler has employed when it comes to the basic human needs of Camp Liberty residents, as well as the Iraqi government implementing and executing on the orders of the Iranian government. And that's really what the entire situation is when it comes to this, perhaps some may view it as a complex refugee situation at Camp Liberty. It's not complex. It's very, very simple. We've got a group of opponents of the Iranian government who have every right, according to the human rights laws and the principle of the human rights, that are entitled to the refugee status. So what's not really clear is the biases at play. So what can be done in terms of immediate next steps? What can be done is to bring back the T-walls. The T-walls, about 17,500 T-walls that can be put up for the safety and the security of the camp. And it is not in violation of the charter of the UNAMI. In fact, going back to your point around security and the safety, it is in adherence to the basic principle of UNAMI. So that needs to happen immediately. Camp Liberty is 80 times smaller than Camp Ashraf. The density you talked about in terms of the population at Camp Liberty versus the broader access to, just basic access to space that they could get in Camp Ashraf. They need to move back to Camp Ashraf. They need to be transferred back to Camp Ashraf until the eventual settlement happens. So with that said, my call is act now, UN Security Council, act today, because the blood of my loved ones and my relatives and every resident of Camp Liberty would be on their hand if they don't act today. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming today. Welcome. My name is Alan Taslimi. I represent the Iranian American Association in New York and New Jersey. And today I'm speaking on behalf of thousands of Iranian Americans whose loved ones are at Camp Liberty, a detention center, a place that has been called by some of the highest level officials, perhaps worse than Guantanamo Bay. And when I say that, that is a fact. The National Security Advisor to President Obama, General James Jones, recently had an interview with Aaron Burnett of CNN, and he referred to Camp Liberty as perhaps inferior to Guantanamo Bay. I have a brother at Camp Liberty. He's badly wounded. He lost both his lower limbs, the use of his right hand, and partial use of his vocal cord. He was working for his master's degree in mechanical engineering here in the United States, and he left to liberate his country from the yoke of a group of thugs who have been running the country for 3.5 decades. I also represent the voice of thousands of Iranian Americans who are supporting the cause of the Camp Liberty and Camp Ashraf residents. One important element I should point out at this juncture is that as the president of Iranian American Society in New Jersey and New York, we have been able to acquire greater than 80% support from the representatives of the American people in New Jersey. That constitutes about 3 million people here in New York. I also wanted to point out a few issues related to the actions taken by the United States or not taken by the United States, as well as the United Nations and Mr. Kovler. The United States, in a quid pro quo with the Iranian regime, bombed Camp Ashraf, even though they had been told by the PMOI, MEK, that their position with respect to the war is neutral, and the coordinates of their positions and their camp had been presented to the coalition forces and the U.S. Embassy in advance. As a result of that attack, bombing, 50 residents were killed and many hundreds were wounded, including my own brother, who lost his legs and his arm. In the aftermath of that, the U.S. made a written commitment to each and every one of the residents to protect them. The United States Secretary of State indicated several times, that's Mrs. Clinton, that the relocation was an American plan, and it was a good plan, and that the U.S. will visit the camp regularly and frequently. That has not materialized. Liberty is a prison camp, is a detention center. And one indication of that is, I just wanted to make an analogy, and that analogy is that the security at Camp Liberty, or detention center, is so bad, so horrible, so abhorrent, that the residents have had to dig foxholes to protect themselves. Now, can you imagine, we've had temperature of about 80 to 90 degrees here in the eastern United States the last few weeks or days. At 120 or 30 degrees, you try to dig holes in 120, 130 degree temperature and see what happens, to just protect yourself. The problem is that the recent attack that happened on February 9th, it happened right at the very busiest time of day, on a Saturday afternoon at 1:15 p.m., with multi-platform rockets being carried close enough to Liberty where the camp could be targeted more accurately. Now, who was responsible for that? I believe we have a video that has been acquired by the Iranian resistance that demonstrates and shows that the Iraqi soldiers and the elements of the terrorist quds force were involved in that particular attack. And were it not for the vigilance of the residents of Camp Liberty, the humanitarian catastrophe would have been of disproportionate peril that would have sustained another darkened stain on the history of the United Nations and the United States for the fourth time. As my colleagues indicated, we are demanding that the United States, the United Nations, and the United Nations Security Council make immediate provisions for the protection of Camp Liberty residents. As the professor indicated, the first thing that they have to do, they have to return the T-walls. These are the immediate requests and demands that we have from the Security Council, that it will be meeting on the 16th and listen to the report of Martin Kobler, and on the 24th, when the next UNAMI mandate is going to be, of course, approved, and the next SRSG will be appointed. And the security and protective vests, gear, he returned to the residents for the time being, for the short period. And their helmet as well, so that they have some semblance of protection. As a result, we do demand, on behalf of the relatives and Iranian-American associations, Iranian-American communities throughout the United States, as well as the Iranian-American relatives and families of Camp Liberty and Camp Ashraf, to return our brothers and sisters, our family members, to Camp Ashraf until such time that their final disposition is determined. I want to thank you, every one of you, for coming here today, and also my colleagues here today for their wonderful presentation. Thank you.